the 15th of April 1912, the RMS Titanic met disaster and sank in the North Atlantic Ocean. Renowned as the largest and most opulent ship globally, the Titanic boasted cutting-edge technology, including 16 watertight compartments designed to ensure its buoyancy in case of damage. This led to the widely held belief that the ship was, rather ironically, unsinkable. However, just 4 days into its maiden voyage, the Titanic collided with an iceberg near Newfoundland, Canada, causing harm to the ship and breaching its supposedly impenetrable compartments. Due to a limited number of lifeboats, numerous passengers were unable to evacuate. Within hours of the collision, the Titanic succumbed to the ocean depths, claiming the lives of approximately 1,500 passengers. So why did this supposedly unsinkable ship sink? Well, on the anniversary of the sinking, I thought we could cover this topic. Now, the easy answer to this is the iceberg. But it's not the only reason. And unfortunately, there is no one reason why the Titanic sank. It was a combination of, how do I put this nicely, multiple f-ups.
From a certain point of view.
So, let's have a look at them. The delay. Okay, so we need to go back 6 months before the collision to September 1911. The construction of the Titanic was being completed at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. The Titanic was commissioned by the White Star Line shipping company, and it was the second of 3 identical ships: Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. On that note, if I do show a picture of either the Olympic or the Britannic and claim it's the Titanic, I do apologise, as they can be quite difficult to tell apart in pictures. On the 20th of September of that year, Titanic's sister, the Olympic, was about to set off on her 5th voyage through the Atlantic and was sailing through the Solent, parallel to a Navy warship called HMS Hawke. The captain of these ships decided to have a race.
It's not going to go well. It just isn't. It's going to be an accident.
The channel was quite restrictive, and the Olympic eventually tried to move out of the way of the Hawke, but unfortunately it was just too little too late, and the Olympic effectively cuts up the Hawke. Not like with a saw, but like if someone was to cut you up on a roundabout, and the collision was imminent. Being a warship, the Hawke was designed to spike other ships, and its hull was built basically as a battering ram, and it went into the side of the Olympic. The Olympic came out of the collision with nothing more than a few cracked plates and popped rivets, which was pretty good, as there were very few ships at this time that could have survived such a collision. The only reason the Olympic managed to stay afloat was because its bulkheads had contained the flooding. The Olympic, like the Titanic, contained a series of internal bulkheads which divided the ship into watertight compartments. This meant that, despite having a hole in the side, the Olympic was prevented from flooding, as the bulkheads had stopped the whole ship from flooding, which allowed it to stay afloat. Surviving an attack like that planted a dangerous thought into people's minds. If you can survive being hit by a warship and sail home, then the Olympic was virtually unsinkable. The captain of the Olympic at the time of her collision with the Hawke was Captain Edward Smith, and he would go on to be the Titanic's captain on her maiden voyage.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Now, to be fair to Captain Smith, he would eventually lose his life in the Titanic tragedy and go down with his ship. And I don't want to start bad-mouthing the dead, especially as this is quite recent history, so I won't lay into him too much out of respect for him and his family. However, some of his decisions, like racing a warship, are questionable, and I do not condone them. So I will try to be impartial, but I'm not making any promises. Captain Smith was the Commodore of the White Star Line, and as such, he got to take out the new ships on their maiden voyage. As technology and health and safety advanced, the ships became more powerful. Smith got more confident, if not even a bit cocky. By the time he got to the Olympic and Titanic, he did believe they were unsinkable. Here is a quote from Captain Smith in 1907, 4 years before the Olympic and Hawke collision. "I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." And when talking about the Olympic, he declared, "The Olympic is unsinkable, and the Titanic will be the same when she is put in commission." Why, he continued? "Either of these vessels could be cut in halves, and each half would remain afloat indefinitely. The non-sinkable vessel has been reached in these two wonderful craft."
This is why we can't have nice things.
Following Olympic's collision, she had to be rushed back to Belfast for repairs. For White Star, it was a matter of urgency to get Olympic back up and running as soon as possible. She's got bookings to take people across the Atlantic, so the construction of the Titanic was put aside so Olympic could be fixed. Prioritising Olympic's repairs over Titanic's construction delayed her maiden voyage by 3 weeks. Okay, I can hear you, 3 weeks? That's not really anything major. Except April was iceberg season in the Atlantic. Usually in April, you'd expect to see about 125 icebergs. That year, there was over 400. A warm winter in 1911 had caused the ice to melt, separate, and drift into the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Had the Titanic gone on its maiden voyage 3 weeks earlier, like it should have done, in March, the amount of icebergs could have been less. The RMS Titanic pulled out of Southampton Harbour on the 10th of April 1912, with approximately 2,200 passengers and crew to New York. The plan was for the ship to arrive in America on the 17th of April. In order to do that distance in 7 days, the Titanic had to maintain an average speed of 18 knots. When she hit the iceberg, she was doing 22. Had the ship been going slower, it may have been able to miss the berg. But why was the ship travelling so fast? The next section is disputed due to lack of evidence to support this claim. As with anything, it's how you interpret the evidence in front of you. So I'm still going to include it, as the Titanic going too fast is arguably the most avoidable out of all of these mistakes. Speeding. Captain Smith had a nickname as the Millionaire's Captain, and that was because people loved travelling with him. People would book on a ship because he was the captain. We're talking that sort of level. He was sophisticated, charismatic, and very good at schmoozing the first-class passengers, very much filling the part of a captain. Smith also liked to get his passengers to their destination as fast as possible. It looked good for the White Star Line shipping company too, if they got there early. Now, this is where we get to the disputed part.
Allegedly. What does that spell, class? Allegedly.
Allegedly, Captain Smith wanted to surprise everyone with Titanic's maiden voyage by arriving at Pier 59 when the sun came up. And if this is true, I can envision what Smith had in his mind as the gigantic Titanic came into dock at sunrise. However, if he was to achieve this, Captain Smith would have to reach the Ambrose Channel lightship by Tuesday afternoon. The Ambrose lightship sits at the entrance of the Ambrose Channel, which is essentially where you enter New York. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, and essentially Titanic's owner, was on board, and he wanted to show off the opulence and excellence of his new vessel to the VIPs, that he had personally invited on the trip. This included the Guggenheimers and J.J. Astor. It would have been very embarrassing for Captain Smith and the White Star Line if they were late, inconveniencing all of these celebrity passengers. What we do know is that from Smith's logbook is that he was gradually going faster and faster as the engines of this new liner settled down. He was putting on more speed. Smith would average a speed of 21 knots. Fog was quite common when crossing the Atlantic, and fog meant that the ship would have to slow down. Therefore, a lot of the captains would go as fast as possible at the beginning of their journey until they had visibility problems, as it meant that they had to stop or slow down for the fog. They had some time in their back pocket. It was more likely you'd be late from fog than hit an iceberg. An iceberg was the least of Captain Smith's worries. He had, after all, survived a naval ship ramming into the Olympic. And as we saw earlier, that pretty much convinced him that the ship was unsinkable. And if you can survive a naval attack, what is an iceberg going to do? Plus, if you do see a big iceberg, you'll see it from far enough away that you'll be able to steer away from it, right? Right?
I got a bad feeling about this.
The fire. You might not know this, but did you know that the Titanic was on fire when it left Southampton on the 10th of April 1912? What? See, Titanic was powered by steam and the boilers were fueled by coal. The Titanic used 600 tons of coal a day. Sometimes, in some of the bunkers, you could get a combustion of a piece of coal, which would result in a bunker fire. As more of this coal combusts, the heat goes up in that room, and therefore more coal would catch fire. An inquiry that took place after the sinking revealed that a fire had broken out in the coal bunker in boiler room number 5. The fire had started in Belfast and was still burning when the Titanic sailed with her skeleton crew to Southampton. The firemen said they were under strict orders to keep quiet about the bunker blaze. Bunker fires were pretty common in steam-powered ships, and the only way to put a coal fire out is to rake the coal out and feed it to the boilers. Fred Barrett, who was a stoker on the Titanic, said that the fire was so strong that they had to completely empty that bunker of coal to get rid of the flames. The bunker was only finally emptied on Saturday the 13th of April, one day before the collision. The sheet of steel that formed the bunker's rear wall was part of a bulkhead. The heat from the fire was hot enough that it warped the wall, making the bulkhead no longer watertight. The bulkhead in question was the one between boiler room number 5 and number 6. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't have been an issue that poses a threat to the integrity of the ship. Communication. In 1912, transatlantic passengers were not navigating blindly thanks to the widespread use of Marconi's wireless radio technology. These ships were equipped to communicate and share information about the presence of hazardous icebergs, with telegraphists trained in Morse code to send messages to other vessels based on the size and height of their antennas.
Bear with. Bear with. Bear with. Back.
On the night of Sunday the 14th of April, the wireless radio operators were busy sending messages between the passengers and their loved ones on land. The radio operators were employed by the Marconi Company, not the White Star Line. So their priority was getting paid to send out personal and business messages via Morse code, not listening for ship warnings. Although arguably I would say that that is more important, but I guess they had the view of the ship being unsinkable. As such, there was a conflict of interest between the operators' priorities and how urgently certain messages are dealt with. The high volume of passenger messages on that fateful Sunday night was putting the Titanic's senior wireless operator, Jack Phillips, under immense pressure. Phillips had to be swift at sending and receiving Morse code, and he had to be able to fix his own kit. Being in the middle of the Atlantic meant that you couldn't just call for an engineer. Phillips had to deal with incoming passenger messages as well as sending them. These would also include urgent safety alerts from nearby ships. These important messages were marked with 3 letters to highlight their significance. MSG. MSG, or Master Service Gram, was a priority message that was intended to be sent to the captain, and it was used for things such as ice warnings. If they had the MSG prefix, you make sure that the captain gets it. Several ice warnings from other ships earlier that day were marked MSG and were duly relayed to Captain Smith. Captain Smith saw and received all these messages. So he decided to go a little bit further on, about half an hour additional travel, before turning west towards New York. Captain Smith went to dinner with the first-class passengers while messages in the Marconi room started to pile up. The evening before, the Titanic suffered a major equipment failure right into Sunday morning, and Phillips had spent about 6 or 7 hours fixing it. As a result, during this time a very large backlog of communications had built up. At about 10 to 9 on Sunday evening, the SS Messenger, which was a few hours ahead of Titanic and also sailing to New York, sent a message. Saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, also field ice. But the message was never relayed to Captain Smith. Why? Because it didn't have the prefix MSG. When the message came in to Jack Phillips, it meant nothing to him. Had the letters MSG been on that message, he would have prioritised it. But as it didn't, he set it aside and prioritised the passenger messages. About an hour later, the Titanic received another warning from the Californian, which was only 10 miles away. But yet again, MSG was missing from the message. The Californian had radioed to say that they had stopped as they were surrounded by ice. Unfortunately, the Titanic's wireless operators were really busy as they were trying to communicate with Newfoundland over 400 miles away, so they had their radio set switched to a high level. As a result, when the Californian's communication came through, the message would have been extremely loud, as it was fairly close in comparison. The Titanic replied, "Keep out, old man," which meant "be quiet, we're busy." The Titanic cut the Californian off before they had chance to try again or resend the message with MSG. And so, the operator on the Californian went to bed. 10 minutes later, the Titanic hit the iceberg. Binoculars. The White Star Line was one of the few companies who employed specific lookout personnel, which, on the 14th of April 1912, was Reginald Lee and Frederick Fleet. Despite their combined extensive experience, the lookouts lacked binoculars, essential for spotting icebergs. The ideal practice is to use natural eyesight first, and then inspect with binoculars. Unfortunately, the binoculars for the crow's nest were stored in the second officer's cabin. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but there was a reshuffling of officers before the Titanic's departure from Southampton, involving Henry Wilde and Captain Smith, who came over from the Olympic. This led to Second Officer David Blair leaving the Titanic. It is believed that Blair took the key to his cabin with him, resulting in the crew being unable to access the binoculars due to the officer change. In normal circumstances, the binoculars may not have mattered, as that night it was clear. However, it also gave them the confidence that they could travel faster and still see the iceberg. What they didn't take into account was the optical illusion that the air and water density created. Looking at the ocean, they would think that they were seeing water and a bit of haze that would conceal the iceberg to the naked eye. A bit like when you put a pencil behind a glass of water and it looks like it's bending. Fred and Reggie had no idea that the haze on the horizon was an optical illusion masking the iceberg. If they had the binoculars, in theory, they would have been able to see the base of the iceberg through the haze, a lot sooner, giving them vital seconds to steer clear of the berg. This theory is supported by Fleet in a statement he made during the inquiry that followed the disaster. When asked about the missing binoculars, he replied, "I'd have seen the iceberg a bit sooner." How much sooner? Well, enough to get out of the way. It's 11:30 at night, and the Titanic, unbeknownst to anyone aboard, is heading straight into an ice field at a speed of 22 knots. 9 minutes later, First Officer William Murdoch is standing watch while Captain Smith gets some sleep. Frederick Fleet finally spots the iceberg and rings a bell 3 times and gives the signal for danger on the bow. Murdoch looks ahead and can see the berg coming towards them, and he turns to turn the ship. As we know, not a great decision in hindsight. He pulls the helm to the left and then to the right to try and swerve round the iceberg. Initially, Murdoch thought that he had cleared the iceberg. However, he hadn't cleared the shelf that was under the water, and the iceberg breaks the side of the Titanic, under the waterline. Avoiding the iceberg. William Murdoch had done his best to avoid the iceberg. However, if he had struck the berg head-on, the Titanic may have survived the collision. About 1/8 of the ship would have been crushed, but the watertight bulkheads should have held, and the ship would have stayed afloat. Instead, he scrapes the underside of the ship, which arguably caused more structural damage. But to be fair to Murdoch, he could not have made that call. It goes against human instinct to hit something head-on. And also, the Titanic is a brand new ship on its maiden voyage. If he had made the wrong call and dented that ship, that could have been the end of his career. Rivets. The Titanic's hull was made up of metal plates that were fixed together with 3 million rivets, some of which were made from steel. Due to the icy waters, the Titanic's hull would have been below freezing at the time of the collision. I feel like that's
pretty obvious,
but just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. When steel rivets become brittle, which the ones below the waterline would have been, because they can't absorb the energy the same way it does at room temperature, and therefore they snap. The other rivets were made of iron. But why not use all steel or all iron? Well, steel rivets would have been preferable. However, they had to be inserted using a hydraulic machine, which at the time would have been very large, as they required too much force to be hammered in by hand. The downside to this is that the machine was only good on straight edges or surfaces, so in areas where the ship was more angled, like the hull, it would be very difficult to put them in, hence why iron was used for this area. The only problem with iron is that it's not as versatile as steel, and in the smelting process, it produces a byproduct called slag. The slag in the rivets can make them even more prone to fracture when struck by a heavy force in low temperatures. The Titanic had to absorb the impact of the collision somewhere. That's just how physics works. The rivets couldn't hold the ship together, and the rivets snapped, allowing the steel plates of the hull to open up in several places below the waterline. Thankfully, the Titanic had a backup plan with the bulkheads that were designed to prevent the ship from sinking. It's a good thing none of them were damaged in any way.
You serious?
About 10 minutes after the crash, things seemed pretty calm on the Titanic. Most people thought the ship would stay afloat long enough for everyone to get off. Right after the crash, water started pouring in fast, but it slowed down as the pressure inside matched the pressure outside. As news of the crash spread, some passengers went to the deck to see what was going on. But there wasn't any panic. The boiler. Fred Barrett, a fireman aboard the Titanic, finds himself in a room slowly filling with water. Seeking safety, he retreats into the next compartment, closing the watertight door behind him, and ends up in boiler room number 5. Inside, Fred is surprised to see water spurting into an empty coal bunker. Though he shuts the bunker door, knowing it's now no longer watertight, he has to do something. Over the next hour, he works tirelessly to keep the ship afloat, attempting to organise a rescue effort to pump out water and extend the ship's lifespan. Suddenly, a rush of green, foamy water crashes into the boiler room, making Fred realise there's nothing more he can do. He quickly heads to the nearest emergency ladder and exits the area. At this point, water has flooded beyond the 4 compartments that the Titanic was originally designed to handle. Having exceeded the 4 compartments, the ship now begins to sink quicker than before. The compartment that Fred had fled from was the one that had the bunker fire that was mentioned earlier. Just as a quick recap, the fire had warped the bunker's rear wall, which was part of the bulkhead, although how much the fire-warped bulkhead contributed to the flooding is controversial. The portholes. After the collision, the ship came to a stop, and naturally curiosity takes over and people opened their portholes to have a look at what was going on. As the fate of the Titanic became clear, the crew ordered passengers on deck for evacuation, and when they went up to the lifeboats, they left their portholes open. As the passenger compartments of the Titanic began to flood, the open portholes meant that water came in at a faster rate. In fact, 12 open portholes would have doubled the iceberg damage to the Titanic. And of course, there were hundreds of portholes in the Titanic's bow. There were about 300 passenger portholes. The bulkheads. Again, the bulkheads, which have already proven to be problematic, were too short. They should have reached the passenger deck level, but they didn't, because the designers wanted more space for the deck and more rooms for the passengers, which is great, but once the water reached the top of the short bulkheads, they become useless, and the water spills over the top, flooding the passenger compartments and public spaces above them. At 2:20 on the morning of the 15th of April 1912, the Titanic finally sank into the frozen depths of the Atlantic Ocean, about 2.5 hours after hitting the iceberg. Okay, and here are some honourable mentions. The following didn't really contribute towards the Titanic's descent into the ocean, but it didn't help the evacuation or preservation of lives, which is why I'm tagging it at the end. Lifeboats. I think this will probably be the most infamous one on this list, as the Titanic notoriously had fewer than 1,200 lifeboat spaces for her 2,200 passengers and crew. Back in 1912, they figured that if a ship ran into trouble, another one nearby would come to the rescue. Transatlantic ships kind of had set paths, like tram lines, so they wouldn't crash into each other, kind of like how aeroplanes operate today. Because of this, a ship was usually only about 60 miles away from a potential rescue. That's why most of these ships didn't bother having lifeboats for everyone. The idea was that you'd get picked up by another ship nearby, and the lifeboats were just meant to shuttle you from sinking ship to the rescuer. Cross-communication. There was a small cargo ship, the Californian, within sight of the Titanic, roughly 10 miles away. Unfortunately, it didn't respond because their radio operator had already gone to bed. In a desperate attempt for help, the Titanic's crew started launching rocket flares to signal their distress. The Californian did notice the rockets, but when informed, its captain didn't recognise them as distress signals, given that many signals were done with rockets at night during the 20th century. The lack of an international standard for flares and distress signals likely led the Californian to consider it a firework display. Another ship, the Carpathia, did pick up distress signals from Jack Phillips and immediately steamed towards the Titanic, though it was 58 miles away. While awaiting rescue, Jack continued tapping out messages like, "We are putting passengers off in small boats, women and children, cannot last much longer, losing power." The Carpathia arrived over 1 hour and 30 minutes after the Titanic had sunk. Unfortunately, among those who went down with the ship was Jack Phillips, who remained at his post until the very end. And that's where I'm going to leave today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, leave a like, and make sure you turn that notification bell on so you never miss an episode. And that's it from me, guys. Until the next one, have a wonderful day.